Hi everyone, so I'm Manuel from Open Lab at Newcastle University, and I'm going to talk to you about participatory media creating spaces for storytelling in neighbourhood planning, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-authors Geoff, Vigar, Tom Bartindale and Rob Comer. So before I go any further, I'm going to just give a little bit of a background to what neighbourhood planning is. So in 2011, the UK government introduced the Localism Act. And what that did was the aim was to take power away from central and local government and give that power back to local people and communities. And they did that through a whole host of community rights. But what I'm interested in is in neighbourhood planning. And what that means in urban planning terms is that for the first time ever, citizens can self-organise, come together and create planning policy that once it is completed, it will be officially adopted by local government and it will be used to make decisions about the future of an area. So it has real weight and real power in decision-making processes. And within neighbourhood planning, because it relies on citizen participation, participation should be embedded throughout, from the very beginning of the process right through to the very end, where there is a community referendum to decide on the suitability of the policy. So how do citizens usually participate in this? Well, they usually do so in quite formal ways. So things like a set questionnaire or a written letter that represents their views. Digital technology is not used very often, if at all. They use maybe a website and an online survey, and social media is not used really, and if it is, it's not used effectively. So this kind of, the way this creates problems in a couple of ways. So the first is that it creates this self-interest sort of mode of participation where individuals only opt for, comment on or take an interest in things that are important to them without thinking of the needs of the wider community. And the second thing is that the written sort of formal responses are usually filtered through a narrow framework, and there's a bit of planning jargon which in the UK is called material planning considerations. And basically what that means is if you make a comment, it'll only be taken into consideration if it is talking about the impact of a development, the impact of a policy, or the mitigation of that impact. So it's quite a narrow framework. And really what that results in is communities don't come together to share their views and decide on elements of their place. And the other thing is it loses that rich experiential detail of how we all experience place. But we don't experience our place in isolation or through material planning considerations. I would say that we tell stories of our place and of our homes, of sort of the everyday, indescribable, ordinary things that we experience every day, sort of memories and histories, and all of that is and should be relevant to planning to help decide on the future of an area. And it's something that some planning academics have advocated for, but it's not incorporated into practice very often. And I wouldn't normally put a slide up with so many words on, but I felt like the quote was too important because this is by a planning academic who advocates for storytelling in policy creation. And she says that normally policy is dry and there's no emotion in it, and the policy and the way that it's created is seen as objective because we use technical and scientific methods. And actually that isn't the case, and it shouldn't be the case, and we should be using stories more effectively. And Van Holst takes this a little bit further and creates a model of and a model for storytelling in neighbourhood planning. So he starts with the model of, which basically says that stories can inform policy, but only by chance, that there's no real mechanism of incorporating them. And if they are included by accident, the stories are interpreted and re-represented by the planners who create the policy. And he said that this is really the way that current practice works. Then he says that the model for storytelling says that stories should have potential, they should be seen as special, and if incorporated into practice, they could improve participation and therefore improve decision making. But he said that there's a definite disconnect with practice currently. And these two perspectives should not be mutually exclusive, but at the minute they currently are. And I've introduced this model here because I'll be coming back to it a little bit later on, so bear that in mind. So yeah, bearing all of this in mind, I was interested in neighbourhood planning. As something that is still very new in the planning system, there's a tendency for citizens to do things the way they've always been done. So to do things the way that the planners have done it, or try to do things the way the planners have done it. But actually, because of the openness and in the Act of Parliament, there's actually a lot of room for innovation there. And there's a lot of room to try and incorporate storytelling more effectively. And there's been a huge growth in civic technology in HCI. So from technology for activism, from situated technology, and even technology for story narratives as well. But what I focused on was the use of participatory media, which has a long history as a method, and it's been shown to provide a catalyst for community dialogue, as well as helping communities form around either an issue or a place. So I thought it would be a really good fit to see how participatory media could support storytelling as a way to move away from that individual participation to creating something together. So what did I do? Well, I used a tool called Bootlegger with 2 neighbourhood planning groups in the northeast of England. And Bootlegger is basically a tool that aims to put complex film production and capture tools in the hands of citizens. And it does this through an easy-to-use web tool and mobile app. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I could spend the whole talk just telling you about Bootlegger. But there's obviously more detail in my paper, but also the Bootlegger was actually presented at CHI last year and the year before. So there's plenty of opportunity to find out a bit more about it. So the 2 areas that I worked in were very different. The first area was maybe about halfway through the neighbourhood planning process, and it's split into sort of smaller groups to focus on different topics, so things like housing or transport or other issues that were important to the area. And I worked with 6 of the 7 topic groups, and we did a short storyboarding exercise, but most of the time was spent out in the community filming on site and capturing the stories that they wanted to share. And the reason that they wanted to take part in this, and the reason they saw that they wanted to use this, was to start to build that evidence base for the policy and to help form the policy that they were about to create. And in the second area, this was a very different area. They were at the very beginning of the process. They were feeling quite overwhelmed at what they'd taken on, which is quite normal for neighbourhood planning groups at this stage. So with them, I did something different. I worked with the steering group, and we held a workshop which was much more about sharing stories with each other. So starting to, again, build the evidence base, but also start to frame the future of how they might want to go forward with the neighbourhood plan. So I'm going to focus on 2 key findings today which address some of the challenges that I set out earlier in the presentation. And the first finding focuses on the multiplicity of citizen stories that were collected. So in each of the groups, there was kind of a participant that was viewed by other citizens as more of an expert. And what that really meant was they either had a professional background or an ex-professional background, or they had a specific issue, a specific interest in a particular issue. And what that meant in terms of the group was that they would often dominate the conversation and see their opinion as the truth and something which should be held in priority over other people's views. But through using the participatory media tool and filming out in the community, it allowed synchronous story capture. And what that meant was we could be standing in the same place, filming at the same time, even maybe about the same topic, but each of the citizens could have different views about that issue or about that place. And it started to highlight to all of the citizens that there were multiple views and that actually different stories shouldn't be seen as more or less valid than one another. And those videos that were created became a thing and an object in itself, which started to highlight conflict and political issues between the citizens. But it also started to highlight that who was assembled around that video to discuss it and reflect upon it, and who was not assembled around it. And they started to realise that there might not be a representative group. So the quotes over the far side is part of a wider conversation between some of the participants in the group. And what they were talking about was they'd captured a lot of footage, and they were looking at how they only had videos and stories that related to a specific part of the area and not the whole area. And they started to realise that if they went out and showed other people these videos, it wouldn't be representative. And I say that this was quite significant to me because I'd been working with the groups for a number of months before we did this workshop, and they'd always said that they wanted to be participatory and really take a good inclusive approach, but they never really explored what that meant, and never really they really took that for granted. So this process actually started to help them realise that they needed to maybe seek more stories to add to the conversation and to build a bigger picture and be more representative. And that was something that was quite significant based on my previous work with them as well. So moving on to the second finding, I'm going to focus on the bridging of that model I mentioned earlier. So the first element of this was that the stories were seen as special. So leading on from the multiplicity of stories, those changes in the conversation and those changes in the views were able to happen because the stories and the videos that were captured were seen as special by the participants, and it provided that space for that kind of discussion. And just to highlight again, this is one of the sort of participants that was seen as the expert. The first quote is from the beginning of the process, and the second quote is after we'd been out filming and we'd come back and we were reflecting on the process. And it moved from the expert basically cutting other people off and saying, no, that's pointless, we're not considering that, to thinking actually we need to ask other people what they think, because maybe my opinions are not the same as everybody else's, and we need to seek more stories. So that was only possible because those stories and those videos started to be seen as special by the participants. And the second part of this this bridge of the model is the citizens themselves were filming on the mobile phones, and that meant they were able to capture and represent their own stories rather than that being taken out of context. And this is just a couple of quotes about how the citizens were using the tool. And I highlight this because I think there's often an assumption that well, it's a mobile phone. We all know how to use a mobile phone. We can all video. But actually, a lot of people maybe don't use their smartphone for anything more sophisticated than making phone calls. And that was quite true of the population that I was working with, and it's quite true for the population that were part of this work. So you can see that they started to actually become confident very quickly, which actually enabled them to be able to film and represent their own stories, rather than them being taken out of context or represented by somebody else. And the final part of how we bridged this model was how the videos provided a much more tangible link to policy. So the videos itself were a tangible outcome. The videos were going to be used to build evidence to create policy, but it was also discussed within the workshops how they could be used as well as that. So could we use this method for future consultation? Could we use the videos provided to sort of provoke responses from people that maybe wouldn't otherwise get involved? And even through to the very end of the process, when citizens, the policy, once it's created, has to be examined independently, and that person doesn't know the area. So they were really talking about how these videos could provide that golden thread of participation throughout that shows the examiner more about the area, but also more about how the policies were created and how the decisions were made. So this was the model that I presented earlier. And this is how we can change that using participatory media. So there's a more direct link to policy. The stories are represented by citizens themselves rather than planners. And there's room for stories to be seen as special. And what that means is, rather than it being a potential to improve practice, it actually becomes part of participation and therefore part of decision making, which will improve the outcomes for the citizens. So using participatory media in this space has the potential to bridge the gap between those models and no longer see them as mutually exclusive. So what does all of this mean? Well, we could use participatory media as a way to move from self-interest participation to participating together, to create a multiplicity of narratives that are not seen as more or less valid than one another, that can support discussion and debate and more equally allowing for agreement and disagreement, and that this could also have implications for wider democratic processes and not just neighbourhood planning. So we argue that digital methods of participation should promote synchronous story capture to support inclusivity and the multiplicity of narratives, not only in neighbourhood planning, but in wider democratic processes. Thank you.
Hi, Sean Lindley from Microsoft Research. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more, some of the work we've done on data and citizens, and this idea of multiplicity is quite difficult because it's often difficult to involve more people than other kind of people who want to stand up and be actively involved.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could say a bit more about how the working group was formed, how there's multiplicity of narratives within that, but maybe how you can maybe bring in more narratives from outside that group. Yeah,
I mean, actually, that's a really good question because that links to the future work that we're doing as well. So this was actually my master's work, so I'm now in the first year of the PhD, so basically this will be the basis and I'll be moving on to look at that more in depth. So the groups themselves form, and I wasn't part of that process because they existed before I started to work with them, but quite often in neighbourhood planning, well, there's actually a lot of regulations and rules around it, so dependent on the area would depend on how that group forms together, but usually it's a couple of active people who try to mobilise the rest of the community. But the future work that I'm wanting to do going forward, which I've already started doing a little bit of, is looking at the whole process and getting the perspective of what the process is from the citizens' point of view, because there's a lot of guidance and there's a lot of documentation out there from the experts' point of view about how neighbourhood planning should be done, but that doesn't mean it's how it is done in reality. So the focus of my work now is to look at the citizens' perspective and then see how we can support different elements of that process better. So that might be about the formation of the group, but equally it might be about any part of the neighbourhood planning process.
So I got a quick question. I was really interested in the way you mentioned about these experts, or self-believing experts, and how they kind of dominated and then they suddenly kind of didn't. Was that a gradual process, or was it a very sudden process in response to some sort of data that they saw? Yeah, I mean, I think obviously here it looks like quite a stark change, but obviously it was more of a gradual process. The workshops that I did with the groups lasted anywhere from 2 hours to 4.5 hours, and sometimes I worked with them on multiple days as well, so it was like lots of different factors. So yeah, I think it was something that was quite gradual. The quotes that were up there were by one participant in particular who was actually an ex-planner. So she had a lot of planning knowledge and tended, when I said near the beginning about the citizens tend to do things the way they've always been done, a lot of the experts were generally going for that kind of approach. But yeah, I think it was more gradual. I think it was throughout the process of filming, just observing what was happening, being part of that process together, actually made them stop and question the truth of the stories that they had and of others, and realised that they might have still had strong views, but realised that they can't just say, no, that's pointless, because that's somebody else's perspective. So it was a bit more gradual than what was showed there, but it happened throughout the sort of the workshop.